A Louisiana cheer mom living, according to police, a double life. By day, she was deeply involved in her daughter's world, but prosecutors say she was secretly preying on her teenage classmates, sending them explicit photos and engaging in sexual acts. This is a case that started with a stomach-churning discovery on a boy's phone and led to a string of victims. But the most shocking moment of all, that came from inside the courtroom when her own daughter stood up and delivered a devastating blow. We're on the case presented by Law&Crime. I'm Chris Stewart. Hey, real quick, before we get into this shocking case, I need to talk about our partner and sponsor, Morgan & Morgan, America's largest personal injury law firm. They have more than 1,000 attorneys who have recovered more than $25 billion from more than 500,000 clients. In the past few months alone, a client in Florida received $12 million when insurance offered just $350,000. In Pennsylvania, another client was awarded $26 million. That was 40 times the insurer's offer. Morgan & Morgan makes it easy to fight for what you deserve. You can even start a claim from your phone. So if you've been injured, you can start a claim at forthepeople.com/OTC. You can click the link below or scan this QR code on your screen. This is the case of a Louisiana cheer mom, Leeann Yammarino. There's a lot to unpack here. Now, she was one of those parents deeply involved in her daughter's world. Really seemed like the type of person who's just so supportive of whatever her teenager wanted to do. But behind the scenes, prosecutors say she was committing horrific sex crimes against teenagers. According to police, this all started when a 15-year-old boy's mom made a stomach-churning discovery on her son's phone, an explicit photo sent to him by a 45-year-old woman named Leeann Yammarino. Now, the most gut-wrenching part of this story came during her sentencing, and it involved Leeann's own daughter. We'll have more on that in just a moment. It was really a final heartbreaking twist in a case that began with a very different picture of the woman at the center of it all. Now, Leeann Yammarino, again, 45 years old, lived in Prairieville, Louisiana. By all outward appearances, she was a typical, very involved cheer mom. She was deeply embedded in her teenage daughter's world and activities there for her for whatever she wanted to do. But boy, does that perception get shattered as these allegations came to light. In July of 2024, according to an arrest affidavit that was obtained first by People, detectives from the Ascension Parish Sheriff's Office were called to a residence to speak with, and this is a very key detail, 4 different juvenile parents. The first domino to fall was a mom who came forward with a shocking allegation. She told detectives that her 15-year-old son had engaged in sexual intercourse with Yammarino inside her vehicle sometime over the past few months. But it wasn't just her word. This mom said she had proof. Her son had shown her an explicit photo of Leeann Yammarino that she had sent to him of herself over Snapchat. This is according to the affidavit. Now, according to the arrest affidavit, the photo, it was graphic. It showed, quote, a white female lying in a bathtub from her belly button up to her facial area, depicting Leeann's face with both her breasts exposed along with Leeann's face. Now, that was the spark. Once detectives were on the scene speaking with the first 4 sets of parents, so we're talking about 8 people, they learned that this was not an isolated incident. They spoke with 3 other male juveniles right then and there, and they all alleged that Yammarino had been sending them, quote, explicit nude photos and videos over the course of the past few months. This is per the affidavit. Again, this is a woman 30 years older than the 15-year-olds involved in this case. Now, the investigation expanded into August 2024. Detectives spoke to 2 more juveniles who independently alleged that they too had received, quote, explicit photos and videos from Yammarino. That's according to a second arrest warrant affidavit. Now, this led to her arrest, and according to her inmate record, she was charged with 2 counts of felony, carnal knowledge of a juvenile, and 6 separate counts of indecent behavior with juveniles. She was held on a $230,000 bond. Now, faced with a mountain of evidence, Yammarino chose to avoid a trial. And on September 16th, she stood before the judge and pleaded no contest to 2 counts of carnal knowledge of a juvenile and 2 counts of indecent behavior with a juvenile. Now, that decision set the stage for the sentencing hearing that happened on November 18th. And that according to reports by WBRZ, is where her own teenage daughter stood before the court and directly addressed the judge. She asked for the maximum sentence on each and every charge that her mom faced. Judge Gant Turner handed down the punishment. The judge sentencing Yammarino to 26 years in prison. The judge structured it as 10 years for each count of felony carnal knowledge of a juvenile and 3 years for each of the 2 counts of indecent behavior with a juvenile. Upon her eventual release, Yammarino must register as a sex offender, and if she serves her full sentence, she'll be 67 years old. Joining us now to talk more about this case is John Clune, a former prosecutor and a civil sex abuse attorney. Thank you as always for being with us on Law and Crime. There's always, these cases are just, you read them and it's just, how does this even happen? What do you make of the behavior of this mom and what she eventually ends up pleading guilty to?
Yeah, I mean, it's incredibly disturbing. I mean, the fact that you have the list of other kids that she was sexting as well makes it look, A, a lot more predatory, and B, just obviously a pattern of misconduct. And I would say that if we know of 4 or 5 or 6 kids, that's probably not the limit of kids she was at least grooming.
Because you look at her being this cheer mom, and we've covered a lot of cases where you see someone who's an educator or a coach, but this is the mom that is very much involved in a group of people, involved in their daughter's lives. So it could be seen as an unofficial position of trust. What do you make of just the profile of this woman, Leeann Yammarino, where it seems like she was the kind of mom, I think of playing youth sports growing up. You knew parents of other kids, like on the team, and parents of your friends. What do you make of just the profile of what we know about her thus far?
I think it allows somebody like her to slip a little more under the radar. I mean, I think that, first of all, a lot of parents are probably more trusting than they should be when other adults are involved in our kids' lives, but we get a little bit of training and exposure to other cases in the news about teachers or priests or other types of positions of trust where we have a little bit more of a sense of we should be suspect if there's an additional amount of interest in our child. With somebody like a cheer mom, I think the radar is a little bit off. So I think it allows her probably to be able to have access to kids with maybe a little bit more regularity than other types of adults showing interest in our kids where a parent might say, this doesn't feel right.
I mean, as a parent myself, I feel like from covering these stories, I just find myself constantly thinking like it feels like you can't trust anyone. And in this type of case, or even now where you know that there's lines that can't be crossed when it comes to teachers, and to your point, like a religious leader, because we've sadly seen cases like that. Here, I mean, if you were even as a parent friends with this person because your kids were on a similar team or in the same class, like you could see how she might be able to cross that line in a way that other parents wouldn't realize. What stood out to me too was her sending these explicit photographs to people 30 years younger than she was, and one that's described, it seems like it was staged in a bathtub. She's sending these nude photographs to young people, and it just seems, and I know there's no answer to this when you're like, why does somebody do this? But it seems like if you were sending a minor those pictures, like she is putting the evidence right out there, which is good from a prosecutor's standpoint. But what have you seen just with people who violate young people like this as to why they would send these pictures?
Yeah, I think offenders can be really reckless when it comes to digital evidence, whether it's text messaging or photographs. In many ways, they do a good job of making decisions that are leading them to not get caught. But when it comes to this sexting and the photographs, it's a very, very effective way to continue kind of the last levels of grooming before you get to the actual abuse. And we see time and time again offenders getting really reckless about those kind of communications, which ends up being incredibly helpful for the prosecutors.
Without a doubt. And even on Snapchat, I feel like you're still able to get enough evidence to show that something happened, even though Snapchat has this reputation of being something where it can just disappear. How often are you seeing that app being used in cases like this?
It's used quite a bit, and quite often the information does get deleted, but we've even seen cases where offenders are actually saving the communications. We were talking about a case a few weeks ago where that exact thing played out, where the offender was actually saving it on their app, and so the law enforcement got a subpoena and were able to get those communications, which were very helpful. Snapchat has really taken over the communication world for most kids. I shouldn't say most kids, but for many, many kids in America, my kids included, Snapchat is the #1 go-to communication tool. So it's becoming a significant part of investigations for sure.
It seems like every single case, not every case, to not be unfair to Snapchat, but it does seem like it comes up a lot. And it's always a little bit bizarre too when you see someone who's in her 40s on Snapchat, because I feel like the demographic is so much younger these days with people who are on that app. A bizarre part of this too, and it's, bizarre is maybe not as serious a word, but she was a mom of, knew these kids apparently through her daughter. And we've seen other cases where just recently there was one in Illinois where you have a mom who ends up being accused of sexually abusing her teen daughter's ex-boyfriend. There's another case I did in Connecticut where a woman just pleaded guilty to a very similar crime of sexually abusing a young person who had dated her teenage daughter. I guess, how common is it that you actually see that type of connection between an abuser and a victim?
No, I don't think it's that common in terms of cases that we see. It doesn't mean that it doesn't happen with enough regularity. Apparently it does, because we're seeing more and more of these cases. But having these cases where you have somebody like a mother, first of all, although we're seeing a lot of cases of mothers or women abusing children, it is a smaller percentage than men abusing children, so that keeps it lower. But then this dynamic of a mother abusing kids that are friends or classmates or whatever of their children is just not something that we've seen a lot of, though it makes a lot of sense. I mean, if you're an offender, those are the kind of kids that you're going to have the most access to and be able to groom most regularly, because you do have that sort of connection. You probably know from your kids, like some of your kids' friends are they're like an extension of your family. They're over at your house all the time. They're over for dinner. For somebody who's an offender, there's this really significant opportunity to be able to groom your kid's friends. So I guess it's not surprising, even though historically we haven't seen it as much until more recently.
Yeah, and maybe it's just a string of it happening, recently, or at least being in the news. But it's just a very, I guess, interesting, bizarre kind of twist to a lot of these cases. For the teenage daughter, I think of her, she had to go up in front of a court, and then she asked for her mom to get the maximum amount of time in prison for this case. I guess and I know it's obviously a lot of pressure to put on a young person, but how does the court typically handle that, where you're asking a daughter to help determine how long her mom will have to spend a good amount of her life behind bars?
Yeah, well, these sentencing hearings, or these crimes are so, I can't even imagine the impact of this case on the woman's daughter. This is more than a worst nightmare. You couldn't even think this up if you're a 14 or 15-year-old kid, that this is going on. So this is devastating for this kid. So on the one hand, the court wants to recognize that the fact that this child is saying, "Lock my mother up for as long as you possibly can," it's not that voice is what guides the court and what's the right amount of years, but it's evidence to the court of just how damaging this crime has been to the offender's own child.
Why is it a lot of these cases seem to end in plea deals, or at least guilty pleas to the court?
Well, it's like, what we talked about with the text messaging and the photographs. Once you have those, pieces of evidence, it's really difficult to mount a different defense. If you didn't have that footprint of the text or the sexting or that sort of thing, then a criminal defense attorney is going to be able to advise their client about other options, saying, "Look, it didn't happen." If it's just one person's word against another, your chance of trial is much more significant. But if there's, if these multiple kids have naked photographs of this woman on their phone, and a track record that it came from the mother's phone, it's extremely difficult to mount any other kind of defense. You really have to try to throw yourself on the court's mercy.
Because I think from the prosecutor's side, where if you have this type of evidence, I mean, you have her dead to rights. Like, you could get her in prison longer than 26 years. She ends up pleading to 2 counts of each, but believes she was facing more than that. What's the strategy behind going the route of a plea agreement as opposed to saying, we're just going to hold her to the highest extent of the law because we have the evidence, where we feel like we really could go get a guilty verdict if this goes to trial?
Yeah, and you certainly could do that, and there would be nothing inappropriate about going for the maximum that you could give. There is a benefit always to both the victims and the justice system to have a guilty plea coming from the offender versus somebody denying it all the way through trial. It also is a benefit to the kids that are involved, because a trial would be an awful experience. I would imagine even the child of the defendant would have to testify or would likely testify in the trial. So you're saving a lot of trauma and emotional distress for a lot of people by getting a plea bargain. And again, as a prosecutor, you're glad if somebody is willing to take responsibility for what they did. Now, there's some cases where you just say, look, there's no offer. You plead guilty to what you're charged with, or that's it, or we're going to trial. But it's not uncommon, again, because of the idea that you want to save some of these victims from the trauma of going through the criminal justice process. It's appropriate to make some sort of offer. And the offer they made probably is not that significantly different than if they had gone through to trial and got convicted of everything.
Because I think of what this woman, she's 45, and she'll be, if she serves all 26 years, I mean, she's going to be in her late 60s when she gets out, and she'll have to register as a sex offender. And you think of the years that you're losing of your life, it seems like a very, very significant, potentially fair sentence for what she's accused of doing. For the teenage victims in this case, what type of impact does being the victim of sexual abuse, especially at an age like 15, have on somebody?
Yeah, it depends on the individual, and I'm not a psychologist, although I pretend I am sometimes, but it's a significant impact. For some kids, it can have, lifelong issues around, trust with adults, particularly trust with adult women. When they start, getting into relationships themselves, it can affect their individual relationships. When they have a kid, and that kid starts getting to an age where they're having contact with other adults or other family members' parents, I mean, it can have a real significant impact on a long-term basis.
And then when I look at the people who are the perpetrators of this, people who are predators, people like Leeann Yammarino, and I don't know much about her background other than on the surface, she seemed like this very typical cheer mom that we've all seen before. But just in your experience, generally speaking, I mean, what happens in someone's life that leads them to the point where eventually they're this person, and in this case, someone who's in a bathroom, like sending explicit pictures to minors? Like, how does it get from, I guess, what typically happens in someone's life where then they suddenly become the person like the woman we're talking about here?
Yeah, in my experience, it's not one particular pathway that gets you to this. We've seen offenders that maybe had sexual abuse in their childhood. It could be offenders that have domestic violence in their, adult relationships. It can be somebody who doesn't have any kind of abuse but has either, a combination of a personality disorder, but also some very unhealthy emotional issues in their upbringing, but no specific, physical abuse. And then there's plenty of folks that we don't know. We can't identify, something, until that they're in some extensive therapy and work with somebody that somebody might get some idea of what led to this.
And for the victims of this case and their families, because they're minors, and I mean, I think of the lifetime of therapy that they could be in to deal with issues that come with being a victim of sexual abuse. Is there a civil suit, or what type of, outside of the criminal system, what actions could they take?
Yeah, so with the information that we have right now, they might have a civil suit against the individual offender, but how much, most people don't have enough money to really satisfy a civil judgment. So although they could bring a case, there's nobody's insurance policies are going to insure them for sexually abusing minors. So it's really just a question of, does the offender have the resources to be able to pay something civilly? Sometimes they do, and sometimes it's not a massive amount, but it's enough to be able to contribute to therapy costs. But quite often the victims are left with the only resources are things through the criminal justice system, like crime victims compensation, that'll pay for their therapy for some period of time.
That's, it's so difficult when you think of the impact that sexual abuse can have on someone's life. As someone who's been a former prosecutor, and you see a lot of these cases, and I feel like in the cases that I've just reported on, there's always this line that's been crossed, and even for the parents, it's a level of trust that they have, and maybe it's a teacher, maybe it's a coach, a religious figure, whoever it may be. What advice do you have for parents, just based on what you've seen, when it comes to looking for signs of someone who could be a predator around who you might not expect?
Yeah, and it's, particularly in cases like this where it's a female offender, I think our radar is a little less on. But all I can say is it's okay to be that parent that is a little less trusting of sleepovers or a little less trusting of other adults showing interest in our kids. I think that as human beings, we want to presume that the people are motivated by good things and are not offenders, and so we don't want to overreact. We don't want to be that parent. I think the risk is just too high if we're wrong about that. So I would just say to parents, it's okay to be the more boundaried parents in terms of those connections with adults than maybe some of the other families in the neighborhood or kids in your kids' lives.
Yeah, no, really well put. Really good piece of advice, because we do cover a lot of these cases and they come in all different ways. John Clune, civil sex abuse attorney, former prosecutor. Thank you as always for being with us on Law and Crime. We appreciate it.
Thanks, Chris.
That will do it for On the Case, presented by Law and Crime. Subscribe to us on YouTube and Spotify. I'm Chris Stewart. We'll see you next time.